By late 1962, American involvement in South Vietnam had entered a critical but still underestimated phase. The United States was not officially at war. There were no American combat divisions deployed in full force. Instead, Washington framed the conflict as a counterinsurgency support mission, relying on South Vietnamese troops to fight while American advisors, equipment, and doctrine provided the edge. This strategy rested on several assumptions. First, that superior technology could compensate for unfamiliar terrain. Second, that mobility, particularly helicopters, would negate guerrilla advantages. Third, that the enemy lacked the discipline and firepower to withstand sustained modern operations. Ap Bac would quietly dismantle all three assumptions. From a U.S. military perspective, Ap Bac was designed as a demonstration of doctrinal success. Intelligence indicated a Viet Cong radio unit operating in Din Tuong province. The assessment categorized the enemy as lightly armed, defensive, and likely to withdraw under pressure. The terrain, rice paddies, canals, and scattered tree lines, was considered suitable for mechanized and air-mobile operations. American planners viewed Ap Bac not as a battle, but as a controlled operation. It was meant to validate the theory that properly coordinated helicopter insertions, armored assaults, and fire support could force guerrilla units into decisive engagements. The underlying belief was that if guerrillas were denied the ability to disengage, they would be destroyed. What U.S. commanders failed to account for was that the Viet Cong had no intention of disengaging. The Ap Bac operation was structured around a classic hammer and anvil concept. South Vietnamese infantry units would advance from multiple directions, while helicopters inserted troops to block escape routes. M113 armored personnel carriers would provide shock action through rice paddies. Artillery and air support remained on call. From the American advisory standpoint, this was textbook counterinsurgency doctrine adapted for Southeast Asia. The helicopter was the centerpiece. UH-1 Hueys allowed rapid insertion, flexibility, and psychological dominance. In theory, the enemy would be disoriented, outmaneuvered, and forced to flee or surrender. However, the plan contained several structural weaknesses that American doctrine did not fully acknowledge at the time. First, the operation relied on the assumption that South Vietnamese units would execute aggressive maneuver under fire. This assumption ignored cultural, organizational, and morale factors. Many ARVN units were trained for conventional defense, not offensive pursuit against a concealed enemy. Second, the plan underestimated the enemy's intelligence preparation. Viet Cong forces had early warning, well-prepared fighting positions, and pre-registered fields of fire. Ap Bac was not a spontaneous encounter. It was an anticipated engagement. Third, command and control was overly centralized. Decision-making relied on radio coordination across dispersed units, vulnerable to confusion once contact was made. The U.S. military doctrine assumed synchronization would overcome friction. Ap Bac revealed that friction dominated synchronization. When the first helicopters descended toward their landing zones, American advisors expected resistance only after insertion. Instead, they encountered disciplined, concentrated small arms fire as aircraft slowed and descended. This moment marked a doctrinal shock. Helicopters, until then, had been treated as relatively survivable platforms against irregular forces. Ap Bac demonstrated that even basic infantry weapons could threaten air mobility when employed correctly. The Viet Cong did not fire randomly. They waited for optimal angles and effective range. Multiple helicopters were hit, some were forced down, others aborted landings. The psychological impact on American observers was immediate. Air mobility, the cornerstone of U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine, was suddenly vulnerable. From a military analysis standpoint, this exposed a fatal flaw. Helicopters could insert troops, but they could not dominate contested airspace without suppression. At Ap Bac, suppression failed because the enemy remained concealed, disciplined, and patient. This moment forced U.S. officers to confront a reality they had not planned for. The enemy was willing to absorb air power and still hold ground. On the ground, the situation deteriorated further. South Vietnamese infantry units hesitated under fire. Advances stalled. Units went to ground instead of maneuvering. American advisors later described intense frustration. From their perspective, the enemy was exposed, fixed, and vulnerable. But ARVN units did not press the attack. Casualty aversion, limited initiative, and poor communication slowed momentum. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong executed a doctrine the Americans had not yet fully studied: close-in engagement. They deliberately reduced distance, negating artillery and airstrikes. Fire support could not be used without risking friendly casualties. This was not accidental. It was deliberate operational design. From a U.S. military standpoint, this revealed a mismatch between firepower-centric doctrine and enemy adaptation. American doctrine assumed distance favored technology. Ap Bac showed that proximity favored resolve. The introduction of M113 armored personnel carriers was intended to break resistance and restore momentum. In theory, armor would intimidate and overrun lightly armed guerrillas. Instead, the M113s advanced cautiously, constrained by terrain. Rice paddies and canals limited speed and maneuverability. Viet Cong fighters used cover effectively, engaging at close range and avoiding direct confrontation. American observers noted that armor without aggressive infantry coordination became symbolic rather than decisive. The psychological shock that planners expected never materialized. From a doctrinal perspective, Ap Bac exposed that mechanized forces could not substitute for infantry initiative in complex terrain. As the battle progressed, coordination deteriorated. Units lost situational awareness, fire missions were delayed, orders were misinterpreted or ignored. American advisors realized that technology did not guarantee control. Radios did not equal command. In fragmented terrain against a determined enemy, decentralized initiative mattered more than centralized planning. Ap Bac revealed a deeper issue. The U.S. military was attempting to impose a conventional command structure onto an unconventional battlefield. Perhaps the most unsettling outcome for American analysts was the enemy's performance. The Viet Cong demonstrated discipline, patience, and tactical intelligence. They did not flee. They did not panic. They chose when and where to fight. This forced a reevaluation. The enemy was not merely a guerrilla force. It was a politically motivated, tactically adaptive organization capable of defeating superior forces under specific conditions. This realization contradicted prevailing narratives within U.S. command. Ap Bac was observed by journalists. Their reports contradicted official statements. This created tension between military reporting and public perception. For the U.S. military, Ap Bac marked the beginning of a credibility gap that would widen throughout the war. Instead of reducing commitment, Ap Bac convinced U.S. leadership that greater involvement was required: more advisors, more equipment, eventually, American combat troops. From a military standpoint, this was a critical misinterpretation. Ap Bac did not show insufficient force, it showed flawed assumptions. In hindsight, Ap Bac stands as one of the clearest early indicators of how the Vietnam War would unfold. It demonstrated that technological superiority could be neutralized, that morale and initiative mattered more than firepower, and that an enemy fighting on its own terms could survive indefinitely. For the U.S. military, Ap Bac was not a tactical defeat. It was something more dangerous, a strategic misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding would cost far more than anyone realized in January 1963.